This is ICASTnews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City. And this is the Russia folder. Russia these days is celebrating the new year, and as incongruous as it may seem to many, it's Chinese New Year. Yes, Russians celebrate New Year's Eve with the Western tradition, and they celebrate Old New Year's Eve from the Orthodox calendar that was a couple weeks behind the West. But now they're celebrating Chinese New Year, the year of the horse. Russians love the zodiac, love mystery, and they love a chance to celebrate. The year of the horse is bringing in its wake, galloping into the new year, some very unfortunate things, some very cold things, some very harsh things, and we don't mean the Sochi Olympics. In Russia right now, there is a threat to freedom of speech, a threat to the most creative, most dynamic streaming video online television service in the country. Russia has more people using the internet than any country in Europe. Some 19 million people watch Dozhd, an online video service, a television on the web, not unlike ICAST News, except they have a lot more programming. Dozhd is new. It's not controlled by the Kremlin. It's advocating new ways, young people-oriented kind of news. And in preparation for the 70th anniversary of the Siege of Leningrad, which lasted between September 1941 and January 1944, the Siege of Leningrad was one of the heroic battles of the Second World War. In the Second World War, when Hitler decided on January 22, 1941, to invade the Soviet Union, he sent his armies in three groups. One group went towards Leningrad. One group went towards Kiev. One group went towards Moscow. The people of Leningrad were cut off. And by the fall, by September 1941, they were encircled. This major city was cut off from supplies, from food, from heat, from all kinds of things. And the people endured. They endured because across a frozen lake, Russians managed to bring in a trickle of supplies. But Leningrad, in this long period, this 900 days of siege, endured unbelievable catastrophes, death, suffering, torture by Hitler's generals, and torture by General Winter. In the extreme cold, the people made do without heating. They had to keep themselves going in the depths of Russian winter. They had to get together and shovel their streets, dig into canals to find water. They had very little food, and what little food they had was divvied up in small portions. 200 grams of bread for a family. There are famous stories of people surviving the period who said, first mommy died, then daddy died, then the uncle died, grandpa died, the teacher died, my sister died, I'm alone. There was the notion of the Leningrad syndrome. Children who were alone, who had so little food that they became walking skeletons. And after they were walking skeletons, they couldn't walk. The Leningrad disease was a wasting away of a whole generation of people. 1.5 million people died in the Siege of Leningrad. In preparing to observe the occasion, the 70th anniversary, Dozhd asked in an online poll a provocative question. Could the lives of Leningrad residents have been saved if the city had been surrendered to the Nazis? Of course, The person making the decision was Generalissimo Stalin. But the very idea of considering surrender is an anathema to many Russians. It provoked a huge backlash, and they pulled the poll very quickly. But the question is being used by those who hate freedom of speech, who do not like uncontrolled behavior, who do not like television that reaches millions and millions of people. And they're being accused, Dozh Television is being accused of suspicion of extremism, because there is a law in Russia against hate speech. And this is being seen as sticking up for the Nazis, or sticking up for death, or just being extreme. In the West, we ask counterfactual questions all the time. Could the South have won the Civil War? What would have happened if blacks in America were given 40 horses and a mule? We could ask some of those same questions about people in Russia. What if, when serfdom was abolished, had each serf not had to pay for his freedom, had been freed from the collective, and had been given some meager amount of money, would entrepreneurial capitalism have developed and thus the revolution not have happened? An interesting question. The answer probably to the question about surrendering Leningrad, aside from the fact that Stalin probably would never have given in and surrendered Leningrad, is simply that all the Bolsheviks in the city would have been killed, all the Jews in the city would have been killed, all the gypsies, all the homosexuals, and children. Well, maybe we should ask Anne Frank what would have happened to the children of Leningrad. The accusation of extremism is being used by the people who are afraid of a marketplace of ideas to silence and to minimize the audience for Dozh TV. Dozh TV already is losing viewers left, right, and center. Why? Because certain cable companies are cutting it off for fear of extremism. The company that this reporter used to use, Beeline for cable, is cutting them off. What did Dozh do? It did some investigative reporting. It found out that some fancy people with a lot of money were building fancy houses outside of Moscow. And oh yes, some of these McMansions, some of these ugly big cottages, some of these super rich lifestyles of the rich and famous belonged to people who nominally were making small state salaries and were very close to the Kremlin and close to the man who was putting on the big show of the Sochi Olympics. Sometimes telling the truth and uncovering wrongdoing will get you in trouble, will get you the galloping troika of oppression, repression, and censorship. Дорогие товарищи Дождь телевидения, мы с вами. Dear colleagues at Dozh Television, we are with you. Keep telling the truth. Also in Russia, this week marks an anniversary. A remarkable anniversary for a remarkable organization. In the end of January 1989, led by Andrei Sakharov, some bold poets, Boris Yeltsin, a group of men and women got together to form an organization called Memorial. They wanted to commemorate, investigate, and collect material on the lives of people who had suffered repression, primarily under Stalin, in the Gulag, in the concentration camps. They collected historical documents. They held public meetings. In one quite bold episode, they held hands, lit candles, and surrounded the building that symbolized the fear of the worst years of Stalinism, Lubyanka, the KGB headquarters. And eventually in 1990, they dedicated a large stone just opposite the KGB headquarters to those who had suffered in the Gulag. They were given a building where they maintained a historical collection point, memoirs of the victims of Gulag repression. And there have been many good books written about them. The best ones in this reporter's mind are those by Nancy Adler about Memorial, most generally about Memorial, and a recent book about communists who came out of the Gulag and what they did. Memorial continued to expand. It started covering what was going on in the human rights area in the most extreme part of Russia, in the Caucasus, in Chechnya. And one brave woman collecting data about those suffering, Natalia Estemirov, was murdered. Probably murdered by the man who is running that beleaguered republic today, Ramzan Kadyrov. A colleague from Memorial accused him of the murder. Kadyrov brought Mr. Orlov to court for libel, and to everyone's great surprise, Orlov was found not guilty. Memorial is a remarkable human rights organization that has persevered for 25 years, trying to keep humanistic and human values alive, trying to keep the memory of people who suffered alive, and managing to survive at a time when the authorities are hostile to and trying to cut off the financial lifelines of independent, non-government organizations. Memorial, happy birthday. And finally, in the year of the horse, well, it's not a horse of another color. It may be a horse that some people see as green or as a pink snake. It's a horse that's drawing an old traditional Russian wagon in a new way. Russians, as almost everyone in the world knows, have a word for it. The word is vodka. Lancet, the British medical journal, has just published a remarkable study which shows what the consequences of changing policies under changing leaders has been to the life expectancy of Russians who consume a huge amount of vodka. In a remarkable study going back to the Gorbachev years, we see how there have been ups and downs in Russian consumption of vodka. Vodka is little water, water that lives. Well, the study has found that water that lives kills people. 25% of Russian males die before they reach the age of 55. Now, in Britain, also a European country, about 7% of the people males die before they reach the age of 55. So 25% versus 7%. It sounds terrible. But guess what? Even under the new leaders, things have gotten a little better. Because in 2006, it was 37% of males died before the age of 55. Think about it, 37%. And it's attributed, yes, there is a great deal of tobacco consumption. Thank you, Chesterfield, Winston, Marlboro. The Marlboro Man is very popular in Russia. But it's largely vodka. Vodka is relatively cheap. A half-liter bottle, which is half a quart, costs about 180 rubles, depending on the ruble to dollar exchange. That's about $4.50 to $5.50. Russians love their vodka. Russians love to celebrate and to drink, but the price of addiction to vodka has been that life expectancy in Russia is about 64. It's the lowest of the 50 developed countries. What's remarkable about this Lancet study is it shows the fluctuation with changing patterns and attitudes of the government towards regulating vodka. As Russians begin to celebrate the Year of the Horse, perhaps they need to think about reining in vodka consumption. And as we think about this particular chapter of the Russia folder, we think perhaps it's time to pour ourselves a large glass of vodka and toast the success of our friends at Memorial and wish the best to the people at Dozh TV. For ICASTnews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City, for the Russia folder, I'm Jonathan Sanders.